They say you never forget the first time your name is on a deed. And they're right, not because it was joyful, but because that signature marked the beginning of my unraveling. I remember pressing my pen to paper, the weight of years of exhaustion trembling in my wrist. After all the 16-hour shifts at the hospital, after the ramen dinners eaten on the hood of my car, after the endless calculations of what could wait and what had to be paid, I finally bought my house. Mine. Not a shared apartment. Not a couch in someone else's guest room. A modern little cottage on the edge of the woods with thin white curtains I picked out myself and a kitchen I could dance in without hitting a chair. I stood in the middle of that empty living room after the final box was set down and just breathed in the silence. No beeping monitors. No roommates' laundry strewn across the floor. Just space. My space. I didn't cry. Not at first. But I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I laughed. I walked barefoot from room to room, trailing invisible ribbons of ownership behind me. And when I threw my housewarming party the next weekend, I was finally ready to let people see me happy. That was my first mistake. They arrived late, of course. My mother, Linda, always made an entrance like she was stepping onto a stage. My father, Mark, stood behind her like her shadow, pretending he wasn't complicit in everything she did just because he didn't raise his voice. They walked in, took one look around the place, and stopped cold. No congratulations. No, this is beautiful. Not even a hug. Instead, my mother narrowed her eyes, tilted her chin just slightly, and hissed one sentence that split my world in half. You bought this without consulting your sister? I blinked. At first I thought maybe she was joking. But then I saw Claire step in behind them, dressed in a cream cardigan and pearls like she was about to shoot a promotional ad for a legacy trust fund. She let out a soft sigh, flicked her perfect hair behind her shoulder, and added, "You're being selfish. You know this house was meant for me." There it was. The ugly truth I'd known all along but never wanted to believe. The housewarming had nothing to do with warmth or celebration. It was a trial. And I was the defendant. My smile dropped. I took a slow sip of wine, trying to keep my face from cracking. "Meant for you?" I asked, careful not to sound accusatory. "I bought this house with my own money." "You used family money," my mother said, as if she hadn't just committed emotional arson in my living room. I choked out a laugh. "Family money? What family money?" She sniffed. "The savings we gave you during college." "That savings?" "The one I'd used to pay for 2 semesters before I started working nights to cover everything else? The one they'd framed as a gift, but now clearly considered a down payment on my soul? It was $5,000, I said quietly, gripping the stem of my wine glass so hard I thought it might snap. "That doesn't buy a house, Mom." Claire crossed her arms. "Still, you knew this place was close to the preschool I want to send my kids to." She didn't have kids. She didn't even have a job. But that had never stopped her from making the world bend around her imaginary needs. The party went on. Sort of. People milled around awkwardly while the tension coiled itself around every corner of my beautiful new home. I caught a few guests glancing toward the door, weighing whether it was more polite to stay or flee. No one said anything outright, but the damage was done. The shame of it, the embarrassment of having your own parents treat you like a thief at a celebration you paid for, it stuck to me like grease. 2 weeks later, I was served court papers. It came on a Thursday. I was at work, halfway through an ER shift, stitching a cut on a 5-year-old's forehead when a courier showed up with a manila envelope. Inside, the documents were clinical. Cold. My parents were suing me for improper use of family funds and emotional damages to their younger daughter. They claimed I had taken what was meant for the real daughter. Those were the words on the page. The real daughter. Like I was the stand-in. The understudy. The disposable spare. The hospital hallway swam in front of me. I barely managed to finish my shift. When I got home that night, I sat on the floor of my empty living room and stared at the walls. I had spent years breaking my back to build something for myself. And now my own family was trying to tear it apart because I didn't hand it over like some obedient servant. I didn't cry. Not that night. Instead, I started documenting everything. The late-night texts from Claire asking for gas money when she blew her allowance. The time I paid their electric bill in the dead of winter. Every grocery delivery I sent when Mom claimed she was too tired to cook. I built a spreadsheet, column by column, until I had an iron wall of proof. Because I knew them. I knew what they would say. That I was ungrateful. That I was lying. That I owed them everything. But the truth was, they had already taken too much. When I confronted my mother over the phone the next day, she didn't deny the lawsuit. I had no choice, she said, voice cool and measured. Claire is devastated. Claire has never paid a bill in her life, I snapped. She lives off the interest of her own entitlement. She's family, my mother said, as if that erased everything. So am I replied. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Not to them. Not anymore. The days that followed were a blur of legal consultations and whispered conversations with coworkers who didn't know what to say. I started locking the door of my cottage not just for safety, but for the fear of what might come next. Claire started posting vague quotes on social media about betrayal and loyalty. My mother's church friends began texting me in tones that suggested I had somehow fractured the family. And then, the worst blow came. They amended the lawsuit. They were now requesting that the property be transferred entirely to Claire's name on the grounds that she was more suited to build a family legacy. I stared at the papers for hours. That phrase, build a family legacy, stuck in my throat like a bone. I had built everything I had from the floor up. Scrubbing operating room tiles to pay for textbooks. Sleeping in my car between rotations. Saving every cent to one day have a home where I could breathe. And now they wanted to give it to her. Because in their eyes, she was the one worth investing in. I had never known silence could sound like a loaded weapon, but that courtroom, that godforsaken echo chamber of judgments and whispers and glaring fluorescent lights, taught me otherwise. There is a kind of hush that doesn't offer peace, but instead tightens around your chest like a noose threaded with every mistake you've ever made. And when their lawyer, polished shoes, smug expression, voice like varnished glass, uttered the words, she was always just, the placeholder child, I swear I heard my heartbeat pause, almost like it was reconsidering whether this life was still worth continuing. Even the stenographer hesitated, fingers hovering midair above her machine, stunned into a stillness so absolute it felt like time had stepped out of the room. The judge, a woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a top bun and eyes that scanned the room with a predator's precision, raised one eyebrow slowly, so slowly you could practically hear the shift of air in the space between that question and the answer. I didn't tremble, not then. Not after that. Because in that single moment, with those few venom-laced words, my parents' entire mask cracked. And suddenly, everything I had spent years doubting, questioning, burying under the hopeful delusion that I was just misreading the signs, it all erupted like ash from a long-dormant volcano. I took one step forward. Not because I was ready, but because I had no other choice. I have documents, I said, my voice stronger than I expected, though not as steady as I wanted. Receipts. Loan agreements. Bank transfers. Text messages. I lifted the folder I had been clutching like a lifeline because that's exactly what it was. Inside was my salvation. My testimony. My proof. A paper trail of the years I had spent being drained, used, and discarded like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. The judge nodded toward the bailiff, who took the folder from my hands with a kind of reverent caution, as if he could feel the weight of every sleepless night I'd spent putting it together. Your Honor, I continued, because I needed to say it out loud, needed the words to be more than ink on a page. They didn't give me this house. I bought it. Every cent came from my account. The only thing they ever gave me was guilt. Their lawyer started to speak again, but the judge held up one finger, silencing him with more authority than a gavel ever could. Let her finish, she said, eyes not on me, but on my parents who, I noticed, didn't flinch. Not even a twitch of regret crossed their carefully constructed faces. My mother sat with her ankles crossed and her hands folded in her lap like she was at Sunday service. My father, as always, stared straight ahead like he wasn't really here, like he'd chosen the part of the furniture long ago and never quite returned. I opened my mouth, and something inside me, maybe rage, maybe grief, maybe just the sheer pressure of surviving so long without being heard, took over. I was 16 when I started working night shifts at a diner because Claire needed new shoes for her dance recital and we couldn't afford extras. I used my tips to pay for textbooks while Claire got a private tutor. I lived in my car for 2 semesters during med school while they used the family savings to help Claire find herself in Italy for a summer. I turned toward the gallery where a handful of spectators, strangers mostly, watched with morbid curiosity. They told everyone we were a close family, that we were all in it together. But I was only in it when they needed something. Gas money, rent money, bailout after Claire crashed their car because she wasn't used to parallel parking. And when I finally stopped giving, when I bought something for myself, suddenly, I'm not the daughter. I'm the placeholder. A sharp, stifled gasp came from someone behind me. I didn't look. I didn't care. All that mattered was the judge and the stack of truth now resting in her hands. I kept a journal, I added, my throat dry but my voice firm. It's all in there. Every manipulation. Every time my mother said, "You wouldn't want to hurt your sister, would you?" Every moment my father looked at me like I was a broken calculator he couldn't be bothered to fix. The judge leafed through the papers, her expression unreadable. Pages fluttered. The soft sound of paper turning was the only noise in the room, and it somehow felt louder than the lawyer's earlier declaration. When she stopped, she held up one document, angling it slightly toward my parents. "This," she said, tapping the page with a long, manicured nail, "is a mortgage pre-approval dated 9 months before the closing date. In her name. No co-signers. No gifts." She looked directly at their lawyer. "What part of this implies the home was funded by anyone else?" The lawyer opened his mouth, but before he could say a single word, Claire stood up. Not politely. Not carefully. She jerked to her feet like the courtroom bench had become electrified. "Because I told her I wanted it," she said, her voice pitched high and sharp, like a cracked violin string. Everyone turned to her, and she just stood there, arms trembling, eyes wild. "I told her, years ago, that I loved that neighborhood. That I dreamed of raising my kids in a house like that one. She knew. She knew I wanted it." The judge blinked slowly. "Wanting something doesn't mean you own it, Miss Allen." Claire's eyes snapped to mine, and for the first time, I saw her mask break. Not the smug, performative grief she'd flaunted at the housewarming. Not the petulant condescension she wore like perfume. No, this was different. This was desperation. "I deserve it more than she does," she hissed. "I'm the one who'll have a family. Who'll give you grandkids. She's alone. She's always been alone." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. Every person in that room, from the stenographer to the security guard by the door, now saw what I had lived with my entire life. Not favoritism. Not poor communication. But a quiet, methodical dissection of a person's worth based on how well they served someone else's story. The judge sat back slowly in her chair, folded her hands, and exhaled. "Miss Allen," she said, turning to me again, "would you like to request a restraining order?" I blinked. What? "You've provided clear evidence of harassment, emotional coercion, and a pattern of manipulative behavior. If you'd like to proceed, I can have the forms drawn up today." I stared down at the tile floor, at the thin line of scuffed linoleum between me and the defense table. I remembered scrubbing blood off the ER floor during a night shift with 3 hours of sleep and no health insurance. I remembered eating protein bars for dinner in my car while watching real estate listings on my cracked phone screen. I remembered the housewarming, my housewarming, where I was made to feel like a thief in my own home. And then I looked up. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I would." The rest of the court proceedings blurred into bureaucratic haze. Motions were denied. Witnesses were dismissed. The lawsuit was not only thrown out, it was eviscerated. The judge ruled in my favor with a level of finality that left no room for appeal. When the gavel fell, it sounded less like a bang and more like a break, a clean, sharp fracture between my past and everything that might come next. As I stepped out of the courtroom into the brittle sunlight, I felt no victory, no vindication, just silence. The kind of silence that follows a fire. The kind of silence that demands you figure out who you are now that the house has burned down. My phone buzzed. One message. From Claire. You'll regret this. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my gallery, scrolled to the photo I'd taken the day I signed the deed, me on the steps of the cottage, holding the keys with a dazed grin, wearing scrubs and sleep-deprived eyes and joy that had taken 10 years to earn. I looked at that version of myself and whispered, they didn't win. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. But I kept walking, and that, I think, was the beginning of something entirely new. When the gavel came down that day, the sound of it reverberated through my spine like the snap of a chain breaking. I walked out of that courthouse with no confetti, no applause, and no proud arms pulling me into a warm embrace, just a stack of legal documents in a manila folder and the echo of my sister's voice still clinging to the air like cigarette smoke. This was the plan all along, she had hissed, every syllable dripping with entitlement so thick it could have been bottled and sold to every other golden child across the country. Mom said if we got the house, we'd sell it and use the money for my modeling career. Those words. I didn't need to say anything after that. Her voice did the work. Her tone, sliced with venom and spoiled greed, told the court everything they needed to know. Not just that they'd lost. Not just that the case had no merit. But that the entire lawsuit, the betrayal, the ambush at my housewarming, the whispered lies and inflated egos, it was all a scam wrapped in designer guilt and passed off as justice. I'll never forget the moment the judge leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together on the bench, her voice lower now, filled with a weight I hadn't heard before. So you're not claiming rightful inheritance. You're admitting this was a scam. Claire's eyes darted toward our mother, whose face had gone pale and stiff like porcelain left too long in winter. My father, never the brave one, just sat back in his seat, his lips a thin grimace that said everything without speaking at all. Then the lawyer, who had stood so tall when he called me a placeholder, dropped his pen, straightened his tie like it had begun to choke him, and muttered the sentence that sealed the end of their crusade. Your Honor, I withdraw from this case. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the creak of the wooden bench under me, the faint hum of the overhead lights, and even the embarrassed sigh of someone in the gallery. It wasn't just the case that collapsed. It was the illusion. The show. The entire production they had staged, hoping to humiliate me into surrendering everything I'd bled to build, crumbled under the weight of their own hunger. They hadn't come to reclaim a home they once helped pay for. They had come to steal what they could never earn and failed spectacularly. Outside the courtroom, I didn't look back. Not when Claire tried to shout something at me in the hallway. Not when my mother called my name with a voice so hollow it echoed behind her like a ghost trailing a lie. I didn't even look back when my father muttered, "We can still fix this," as if the pieces of their deception could ever be glued back together. That was the last time I saw them. But it wasn't the last time they tried to reach me. 3 days later, I came home from work and saw something sticking out of my mailbox. Not the usual bills or grocery coupons, but a thick white envelope, hand-addressed in my mother's looping cursive that I used to think looked like poetry before I learned it was the script of manipulation. I stood at the edge of my front porch, the wind rustling through the trees like whispers, and stared at that envelope like it was ticking. I didn't open it. Not right away. I left it on the table in my entryway for hours, unsure whether I had the energy, or the foolishness, to read whatever apology or threat or guilt trip they had crafted inside. When I finally sliced it open, The contents were what you might expect from people who were only sorry they got caught. A long letter, 4 full pages, begging for forgiveness without once admitting guilt. They wrote of misunderstandings, of family tensions, of a moment that got out of hand. They said they still love me, that they missed me, that families fight, but real families always find their way back to each other. And then at the very bottom, scrawled in hurried pen like an afterthought trying to dress itself as compassion, was the true purpose of the letter. Claire is going through a lot right now. Modeling is competitive. If there's any way you could consider selling, just to help her start out. I dropped the pages onto the floor. There it was again. The real daughter's dream, paid for by the placeholder's life. The fire that lit inside me that day didn't burn out. It turned cold. It turned focused. And I turned it into action. I knew they wouldn't stop, not until they were embarrassed beyond repair or cut off so cleanly they could no longer reach me with any hand, letter, or lawyer. So I did the only thing left to do. I went public. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was preservation. Survival. I sat down at my desk with a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop. I didn't need to embellish. I didn't need to twist the truth. All I had to do was tell the story the way it happened. The ER shifts. The debt. The housewarming ambush. The lawsuit. The courtroom collapse. And the envelope in my mailbox that asked me to finance my sister's modeling career like I was some silent investor in a family that never saw me as anything but a resource to mine. I posted it anonymously at first, on a forum where stories like mine weren't rare, just rarely believed. Within hours, it exploded. Messages poured in. People who had been used by their families. Women who had worked themselves raw while their siblings coasted on charm. Daughters who were called selfish for refusing to be the family wallet. Sons who were erased the second they stopped serving a purpose. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't anonymous for long. Because someone recognized the courtroom story from the local news. And suddenly, reporters were reaching out. Legal blogs. Influencers who covered injustice in family court. My inbox filled faster than I could empty it. Each message a reminder that the world doesn't just punish survivors, it also listens when we refuse to stay quiet. My parents saw the article the day it went viral. I know because they tried to call. Dozens of times. My phone buzzed for 3 straight hours, each call followed by a message, each message a slightly more frantic plea. Please take it down. You've embarrassed us. We can't go to church. They're talking about us at Dad's job. Claire even called once. Just once. And when I didn't answer, she sent a single text. I hope you're happy. I stared at it for a full minute before replying. I'm not happy. I'm finally free. There's a difference. And then I blocked her. Blocked them all. Changed my number. Installed a camera on my front porch. I started sleeping with my phone on silent, and my door locked with both a deadbolt and a truth they could never unwrite. They thought the case would break me. Instead, it carved me into something harder. Sharper. More certain. They thought I'd walk away humiliated. Instead, I walked away unchained. And every day since, I've kept walking. Past their old rules. Past the versions of myself that begged to be chosen. Past the belief that love is something you have to earn by bleeding. Because here's the thing no one tells you about leaving a family that never truly saw you. The silence that follows isn't empty. The gavel came down like thunder, and I didn't flinch. Not because I wasn't shaking inside. I was. But after everything I had endured, from the slow burn sabotage to the public betrayal in front of strangers wearing blood that matched mine, I had already mastered the art of appearing unbothered while preparing to scorch earth. The lawsuit was dismissed. The case was dead. Their mask had slipped, publicly and permanently. But even then, I knew their arrogance wouldn't let them sit in their defeat. I knew they'd try again if I let them. These weren't people who could accept loss. These were people who saw boundaries as dares and kindness as weakness. So I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry. I didn't walk out of that courtroom with tears in my eyes and forgiveness in my heart. I walked out with a plan. I had 37 missed calls by the time I got to the sidewalk. From blocked numbers, from unknown numbers, from numbers I used to know by heart. I didn't answer a single one. I knew the script. I knew it would start with a soft voice asking if we could talk like a family, and end with a sudden, weaponized sob about how I was tearing us apart. But we weren't a family anymore. We were never really a family to begin with. We were a hierarchy. A system of extraction, dressed up in photo albums and polite smiles at holiday tables. So instead of going home, I took the car straight to the real estate office. No hesitation. No detour. No more pretending that I needed to wait for closure before acting on truth. I walked in, met with my agent, and dropped 3 words that changed everything. "I'm selling it." She blinked, surprised. "Already?" "They made it toxic," I said flatly. "It doesn't feel like mine anymore. And I don't want a shrine to betrayal." We listed it within the week. We didn't wait for perfect buyers. We didn't wait for the market to peak. I priced it smart, high enough to know my worth, low enough to keep the wolves from circling. 2 offers came in within 12 days. I chose the one who signed without countering, without nitpicking, without asking why I was leaving a house that looked like it was pulled from a dream and dropped on earth. They didn't need to know. That story didn't belong to them. When the sale closed, I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I just stood outside the bank, held the final check in my hand, and stared at the thing that had nearly cost me my soul. A house I had built from sweat and sacrifice. A house they had tried to turn into their trophy. Gone. I didn't mourn it, because I was already building something else. 2 weeks before the closing, I had hired a lawyer. Not for court, those battles were done. This lawyer specialized in corporate structure and privacy shielding. She didn't ask questions. She didn't flinch at the details. She just nodded, typed fast, and handed me the paperwork. We formed an LLC. It had a name only I understood, an inside joke, a private war cry, a code I'd carry with me quietly for the rest of my life. Under that LLC, I purchased 2 new condos. Both high-end. Both secured with cash from the sale. Both registered under the Shell Corporation. No traceable connection to my personal identity. No forwarding address. No digital trail that any of them could ever follow. The first condo was where I would live. The second was for power. I wasn't just buying peace. I was building sovereignty. They would never know where I lived. They would never again show up at my door, begging with voices soaked in false nostalgia. I changed everything: numbers, emails, locks, names on files. I disappeared from their map. And while they were still licking their wounds and pretending I hadn't burned their scheme to the ground, I sent one final message. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't a conversation. It was an envelope, delivered to the place they had called temporary, the guest house behind my old home. A space they had stayed in for just a bit, while quietly laying roots like parasites. Inside the envelope was a gift-wrapped truth. The first item, a framed copy of the judge's ruling, black and white and brutal. It listed, in cold legal language, every way they had failed to convince a court that they had any claim to the life I built without them. The second item, an eviction notice. Not a threat. Not a warning. A binding, notarized, 30-day legal order to vacate the guest house. No extensions. No negotiations. No more pretending. The third item, a handwritten note in ink as dark as my patience had become. You tried to take my house. So now? You're out of mine. I didn't need to say anything else. That was the last time I reached out. They tried calling. They tried texting. They tried sending letters to the old address. They tried mutual friends, distant cousins, coworkers, and old professors. They posted vague statuses online about being stabbed in the back and the pain of family betrayal. But no one pitied them anymore. Because I had already told the world what happened. And the world had listened. They didn't just lose the lawsuit. They lost the narrative. They lost the lie. They lost the comfort of painting me as ungrateful while standing on the foundation I built alone. One day, a friend forwarded me a voicemail. It was Claire, raging to someone about how this wasn't supposed to happen. How I wasn't strong enough to cut them off. How she deserved that house because mom said so. I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I didn't even save the file. I just kept living. My new condo felt different. Not just because of the luxury finishes or the way the sunlight hit the glass tile in the mornings. It felt different because there were no ghosts. No echoes. No memories taped to the walls with smiles that were faked for the camera and daggers once the flash went off. This place was clean. This place was mine. This place was the first home I had ever had where I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I didn't fill it with much, just what I needed. A bed that didn't sag. A desk that held more than bills. A coffee maker that brewed just enough for one. Silence replaced the sound of demands. Peace replaced the pressure to perform. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was building. And when people asked where I went, why I vanished, why I stopped calling and stopped showing up to the birthday dinners where I was always expected to show gratitude instead of receive it, I told them the truth calmly, clearly, without shame. I left. Because I had to choose between staying a daughter or becoming a whole person. And I chose the latter. They still tell people I broke the family. They still cry to strangers about how they don't know what went wrong. They still romanticize the past like it wasn't held together by my sacrifice. But I don't hear them anymore. Because I changed the locks. I changed the address. I changed the story. They will never walk through my door again. Not because I hate them, but because I finally love myself enough to never ask for love where only leverage lives. And if they think this was revenge, they're wrong. This was survival. This was reclamation. This was me rebuilding in silence what they tried to steal in noise. They thought they could rewrite my story. Instead, I rewrote our ending.